So do you want your aspect ratio to be like this, or maybe like this, or maybe even like this? Hi and welcome back to the channel. My name is Jude. In this video we're talking about aspect ratios and how they affect your image and how they tell a different story depending on how you interpret them. Now this is something that I've been thinking about for a while now. I'm definitely no expert at understanding what aspect ratios are trying to say. I have some opinions. I'd like to hear yours in the comments as we go through this video. So if you hear something and you want to talk about it, drop it in the comments down below so we can discuss it. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around and we'll get right into it. It seems like there are different interpretations for each aspect ratio. Each one says something different about the story that you're trying to tell in your image. And far too often, photographers aren't putting enough thought in the aspect ratios of their photos, especially when we're talking about digital photography. Now, I've been guilty of this in the past, especially when I was fresh into digital photography. I would just take a picture of a scene, and then when I was editing in the computer decide, oh, this might look cool as a square, or this might look cool as a panoramic, or this might look cool as that, or I saw that thing in the image that I didn't really like, so I'm gonna just crop it out by changing the aspect ratio. I don't think that's really the way we should be thinking about it. At least that's my opinion. I was considering having that whole discussion at that picnic table, but it's actually starting to get kind of cold. I think because the clouds overhead are starting to blow across and starting to get moist in the air. We're not used to it in the desert. So we're gonna do a little walking and talking. Get the blood moving again. I don't know if you can see this power line above my shoulder here. I took a picture of that earlier today when I was scouting around because I have 3 examples that I want to share to discuss aspect ratio. Each one has a different type of subject. Each one lends itself better to a different type of aspect ratio. And I want to hear your thoughts on them in the comments down below. And each aspect ratio, I think, lends itself better to telling a different type of story. And that's really what it comes down to. When we think about aspect ratio, we're thinking about either removing aspects of our scene to simplify our composition, or adding things to it to tell more of a story. And that's why I really like this discussion, because the more you see, the more you get context. The less you see, the more questions you might have. But this is all, again, open for discussion. In a previous video, I discussed how I've basically made every mistake in the photography handbook, but it's really helped me ask questions. It's really helped me learn a lot. And I feel like all those mistakes have really helped me progress rapidly in my photography journey. One of those mistakes was one I think I've already mentioned, is just arbitrarily choosing an aspect ratio while editing the photo. I'd see an element that I'm like, that's a little distracting. I know, I'll do a square crop, remove that distracting element. But what I really like to see is when a photographer very early on decides this is what this needs, while they're looking at a scene, while they're staring at it and going, I know what I need to photograph, or I know how the aspect ratio needs to be with this photograph. I think that's a very important skill to have as an artist, is to predetermine or pre-visualize the scene and how it needs to look in order to make it yours. One photographer who I think does this really, really well is one of my favorite landscape photographers, Thomas Heaton. If you haven't watched his channel, I don't know what you're doing here, go watch his channel. But he pre-visualizes every photo that he takes. He'll look at the scene, he'll examine it, he'll think about it, and then he'll say, I see this as a square, or I'm going to crop this into a 16 by 9. He pre-visualizes it, and that helps him compose the scene better instead of waiting until the very end and deciding in his computer. He's like, oh, I didn't like that element. I'm gonna change the aspect ratio to get rid of it. The thing that really broke me out of this mistake of arbitrarily choosing an aspect ratio afterwards is shooting with film. When I was a kid, I used to be a very picky eater. I didn't like tomatoes and onions and mustard on my sandwiches. So if I ever got one that my mom or dad bought me, I would just pick them off, toss them aside and go, I don't like these things. I'm not gonna eat them. When I hit college and I started buying my own food, that's when I really realized that like every single dollar mattered, and also every little ingredient mattered. I needed to eat as much as I could, and I wasn't gonna waste any money throwing away food when it was perfectly fine and I could get over the flavors. And I actually found it more tasty to have those things on my sandwiches. The reason I want to use this illustration is because when I started shooting film, I started having to buy each photo. It wasn't free like a digital photo, and that meant every photo counted. And I didn't want to waste my frame, if that makes any sense. So cropping out elements of your photo because you didn't compose it right while you were out there on the scene, that's just laziness. To me, it was laziness for me. And so I started to really think about each frame, each composition, each photo, and the elements in it so that I would not be wasting the photo. And that has transferred over to digital photography, where I'm much more careful about my framing. I'm much more careful about the different elements. And I don't tend to crop out stuff into different aspect ratios very often anymore. I actually tend to just use the full frame, not a full frame, but like the full APS-C sensor. I rarely crop, so this was actually a fun little exercise, forcing me to actually crop images that I wouldn't have normally. So example number one is a classic interrupted landscape, like I like to call them. You've got this landscape with a foggy background and a couple power line posts or whatever those things are called, interrupting that landscape. And that becomes the main subject, that power line. Now, you can see, hopefully in this photo here, I've stitched together a panoramic so that I can get a nice typical aspect ratio, like a 1:3, and in comparison to something like a square crop or a 3:2. Having more context to me in this particular scene just works so much better. That lack of context makes it feel, I don't know, like there's not enough to help you interpret what's going on in the story. But that's just me and what I'm seeing in this scene. Maybe the square works really well to simplify so that you're not distracted by different elements. But that's really what this discussion is. Like, how would you have cropped it, if at all? Would you have used your full sensor? Would you have, simplified things with a square, given more context with a panoramic? Let me know in the comments. I'm gonna head back down because I feel like this trail leads to these houses behind me. Let's see those rich people. I definitely don't live up there. So scene number two, this beautiful oak tree with bronzed leaves, a nice swing, squirrels scurrying around in the ground. What a nice scene, right? But how distracting might it be to have a big panoramic of that scene versus just using the regular sensor or a square to really hone in on that swing? Each one has its merit. Each one tells a different story. Each one asks different questions. Which do you prefer? What story captivates you? Where do you feel most drawn when you're looking at these photos? And those are the types of questions that I'm asking myself, and I'd love to know your thoughts. And the final scene is a wildlife scene. This is the squirrels running around in the trees or across the ground or on a fence post. Each of these photos, again, tells a different story. If you really want to focus in on just the animal, the square seems to remove a lot of distraction. If you're trying to put the animal into context, saying, hey, look, this is where the squirrel is, you might use a larger frame. So depending on what the squirrel is doing, where the squirrel is looking, that tells you a different type of story and calls for a different aspect ratio. Now, I don't have any answers. I wish I did. This video is not about answering any questions. It's more raising them and asking questions of you as you're watching this and you're looking at the photos. Like, how does it affect you? have you ever experimented with aspect ratios like this? Or have you just kind of instinctively used them in the scene? I'm actually asking. This is not rhetorical. Answer down below in the comments. And if you like this kind of content and you want to see more, I've got some other videos that do ask questions, that are trying to seek a more artistic approach to what we're doing with our cameras. And if that sounds interesting, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Check out some of my other content, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.